The night the waves came in so high they swallowed the road. A ragged veteran and his German shepherd stood on the last strip of asphalt before the drop, staring at a house bolted into the cliff like a secret the ocean wanted back. His name was Daniel Cruz. The dog was Shadow, 6 years old, black and sable, one ear nicked, eyes the color of used brass. To most people in Raven's Crest, Daniel was background noise, the quiet man with the faded duffel, sleeping in bus shelters, washing in gas station sinks, always walking, never staying. To Shadow, he was still the soldier who had brought him out of fire. That was enough. Headlights crawled up the switchback behind them, cutting through sleet. A dark county SUV stopped. A woman stepped out, breath fogging, clutching a waterproof folder like she was afraid of what lived inside it. "Daniel Cruz?" He tensed, nodded. She handed him the folder. Inside, a brittle letter, a deed, a heavy iron key that smelled faintly of salt and rust. The letter carried a name he hadn't heard since childhood. Elena Marrow, the aunt who used to whisper stories about the sea having a heartbeat. The aunt who vanished one winter and was pronounced dead, without a body. At the bottom of the page, in shaky ink, "If this finds you, the house has started to listen again. Do not go alone. The dog will hear it first." While Daniel read, Shadow didn't look at the folder, or the woman, or the storm. Every hair along his spine lifted as he stared at the raced dark windows of Stormwatch Cliff, teeth barely parted, a sound too low to be a growl shivering in his chest. Whatever waited under that floor already knew they were coming. Winter in Raven's Crest did not arrive. It settled in and refused to leave. The sky turned a flat gray that pressed down on the town. Rain hardened into pellets of ice that bounced off cracked pavement and stuck to railings. By January, thin snow clung to the fishing pier and the rusting guardrails along the coastal road. Most days, the only sound was the boom of waves hitting rock and echoing through shuttered storefronts. Raven's Crest was not a place people visited in winter unless they had no choice. It felt less like a town and more like the last stubborn cluster of lights, before the ocean swallowed everything. At the far edge of Main Street, where the asphalt broke into gravel, an abandoned seafood shack hunched near the cliff. Its windows were boarded, its sign hanging crooked, promising fresh catch, in faded letters no one believed. Behind it, shielded a little from the wind, Daniel Cruz sat on an overturned crate with a paper cup of cooling coffee. The crate had once held frozen fish. Now it was the closest thing he had to a chair. His field jacket, old military issue, was faded and patched. Jeans hung loose on his frame, boots cracked from too many winters. His dark hair was cropped short by his own unsteady hand, silver showing at the temples. Stubble roughened his jaw. What looked most alive were his eyes, steady and restless at once, quietly measuring every car, every shadow, every change in the lot. Shadow lay at his feet. On a folded, threadbare blanket, paws crossed neatly in front of him. The German shepherd's coat was thick and dark, black along his back, tan along his legs and muzzle. One ear carried a ragged notch near the tip, a scar from a blast on a road far away. His amber eyes moved almost as much as Daniel's, tracking cars, people, and the shift of the wind. When strangers walked past, he watched without growling, measuring distance and intent with a working dog's calm. He did not beg for food or lunge at noise. He saved his energy the way soldiers did when they knew a long night might be coming. Now and then, when Daniel's gaze slid off into nothing, Shadow nudged his knee, pulling him back to the parking lot and the present. They had not always lived behind an empty shack. There had been an apartment once, with a key that turned easily, and a television that talked into the small hours. There had been a bed with clean sheets where Daniel lay awake, listening for engines and shouts that never came. Sleep arrived in short, jagged pieces, and left him more tired than before. Doctors offered pills. Friends offered advice. Nothing quieted the noise in his head. Silence. Inside, four walls pressed on him harder than any storm. One morning he packed a duffel, clipped Shadow's leash to his collar, and walked until the road ended at the water. Raven's Crest was simply where the pavement stopped, and where sleeping under a broken sign felt less suffocating than lying awake in a perfect room. The town got used to them. Sometimes a barista from the cafe dropped an extra muffin on the crate. Sometimes a mechanic left work gloves or a roll of tape without comment. Daniel thanked them softly and let Shadow take the first bite. Mostly, though, they were just part of the background. That was why the county SUV stood out the moment it rolled in. White paint too clean, faded emblem on the door. Daniel saw it reflected in the shack's boarded windows before he heard the engine. Shadow lifted his head. The vehicle stopped a few yards away and idled. The driver's door opened, and a woman in a green county parka stepped out, clutching a thick envelope. She walked toward them with careful steps, boots crunching on frozen gravel. Wind shoved at her hood and whipped gray strands from her ponytail. A laminated badge on her jacket read K. Doyle, county clerk. "Mr. Cruz," she called. Daniel set his cup down and stood. Shadow rose with him, moving half a step ahead, calm but unyielding. "That's me," Daniel said. She stopped at a safe distance and let the dog study her. "My name is Karen Doyle," she said. "I work in probate at the courthouse. You're listed as the sole heir in an old estate case we finally closed. The deceased was named Elena Marrow. Does that mean anything to you?" The name landed in his chest like a stone. For a moment the parking lot blurred, replaced by a small kitchen that smelled like tea and salt. He saw his aunt. Black hair, quick hands tracing wave shapes and sugar on a chipped table. She had been his mother's older sister, the one who let him stay up late to listen to storms and said the sea changed its mind every hour. One winter she walked out into a gale and never came back. Paperwork called it an accident and then a tragedy. Family stopped saying her name. "She was my aunt," Daniel said. Karen nodded and tipped the envelope toward him. "Her house on Stormwatch Cliff and the land around it went through years of court fights," she said. "It's all yours now. We just needed to get this to you." He took the envelope. The plastic crinkled under his fingers. Inside were county forms and a long, old iron key taped to a folded page of lined paper. The handwriting was small and slanted, but he recognized it instantly. "Danny," it began. "If this finds you, the house is still listening. The water beneath it has started to speak louder. Some men believe money can bury anything. Do not go there alone. Take the dog. He will hear it first." Shadow leaned closer, nose brushing the page, then lifted his head toward the distant cliffs as if some note on the wind had answered him. Karen pointed along the coast, toward a dark shape clinging to the rock. "Stormwatch sits up there," she said. 5 miles up the old service road. Whether you ever open that door or not, it belongs to you now." Daniel followed her gesture. Even from here, he could see the outline of the house nailed to the cliff, facing the endless gray water. He had watched storms break around that silhouette for years without thinking it had anything to do with him. Now a key in his palm said otherwise. The ocean boomed in the distance, steady and patient. Shadow's ears stood high, his whole body angled toward the horizon, fur along his spine lifting in focused alertness. Daniel slid the key into his jacket pocket, feeling the cold teeth bite his skin before he let go. For years his life had narrowed to small questions: where to sleep, how to stay warm, when to move on. This was something larger. Whatever his aunt had heard inside that house had finally found him. And if her last line was true, one thing was already certain: Shadow was listening. He could almost feel it humming below. The cliffside house looked like the mountain had once tried to shake it off and failed. Stormwatch clung to the rock halfway between road and surf, half gray cedar and half exposed stone, its stilts driven into the cliff, as if bolted through the planet's ribs. From the end of the service road, Daniel Cruz stood with Shadow at his side, wind tearing at his jacket, salt spray drifting up in cold bursts that stung his cheeks. The dog's ears were high, body angled toward the building, eyes narrowed as if he smelled something inside the rock itself. At the last landing, the stairs ended. At a small platform wedged into the cliff. The front wall rose straight up from the rock, cedar boards silvered by years of salt and wind. The door was thick wood banded with iron, paint peeled to dull scraps around a single brass knob and keyhole. Daniel pulled the iron key from his pocket, feeling its old weight. Shadow stepped closer, pressing against his leg, breath slow, nose working over the seams of the door. The key slid in with unsettling ease. When he turned it, the mechanism answered with a tired clack and a deeper click. The door sighed inward, hinges grinding as still. Cold air drifted out, smelling of cedar, ashes, and something faintly metallic like the air near live wires. Daniel pushed the door wider and stepped aside. Shadow crossed the threshold first. His front paws touched the floorboards and stopped. Muscles along his shoulders and back locked, tail hanging straight, ears fixed forward. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, chest hardly moving as he drew in the air. Daniel waited, forcing himself not to tug on the leash. Slowly, Shadow began to move again, but not like an animal exploring. His path was straight and deliberate. They passed a narrow hall with a bench and hooks, one still holding a faded yellow raincoat and a pair of rubber boots beneath it, then stepped into the main room. The living space opened around a broad stone hearth that anchored the far wall. 3 wide windows faced the ocean, glass clouded with salt but still clear enough to show gray waves folding over themselves below. A sofa sat angled toward the view, a knitted blanket folded on its back. Bookshelves lined one side, spines neat, nothing overturned. A small table held a cold lamp and a single mug ring. It looked as if someone had stood up, mid-evening, and never returned. The quiet had weight, the kind that made Daniel feel watched. Shadow ignored the windows, books, and furniture completely. He padded straight to the base of the hearth, nose close to the floor, at the line where cedar planks met the first row of stones. Shadow stopped. He sniffed once, twice, then set his right paw firmly on a particular block and pressed down hard. His shoulders dipped with the effort. He lifted his head and met Daniel's eyes, holding the stare until the meaning sank in. Here. Daniel crossed the room, heart beating faster. Up close, the stone looked almost identical to its neighbors, but the mortar line at one corner was a fraction thinner. He crouched, set his palm flat on the cool surface, and pushed. The block shifted inward with a gritty scrape. Somewhere behind the hearth, hidden metal moved against metal. A muffled thunk rippled through the wall. To the right of the fireplace, a narrow panel along the baseboard shuddered and slid back, disappearing into the stone. Dust spilled in a thin curtain as it moved. A dark opening appeared, cut straight into the cliff, revealing steep steps dropping out of sight. From below came a faint, steady glow. Not the warm yellow of ordinary bulbs, but a deeper red, the color of a warning light seen through fog. Cold air rose from the stairwell, sharper and wetter than the room above, carrying the mineral scent of caves and old water. Shadow moved to the edge and looked down, ears high, tail low, body calm but coiled. He did not whine or pull away. He simply waited. Daniel tightened his grip on the leash. For years his world had shrunk to parking lots, stations, and small, controllable distances, but his aunt's letter had not led him this far to turn around at the first hole in the floor. He set his boot on the top step. The rock was cold even through the sole. One hand found the rough wall, the other an iron ring bolted in as a rail. Shadow descended just ahead, sure-footed, flank brushing Daniel's leg when the passage bent. With each step, the light grew brighter and the air colder. The sound of the surf thinned to a distant rumble. Stone underfoot grew slicker where condensation had gathered and dried again. The stairs ended in a chamber carved cleanly out of the cliff. The ceiling hung low, the walls smoothed and sealed. A single red bulb dangled from exposed wire, filling the room with dim, pulsing light. Maps covered the rock, printed charts of the coastline, hand-drawn diagrams of underground channels, layers taped and pinned until they overlapped. Blue lines traced rivers, streams, and known wells. Red lines ran deeper, branching like arteries beneath Raven's Crest and the hills beyond. Some of the red routes were circled, others crossed out with black strokes. Numbers and short notes crowded the margins in tight handwriting Daniel recognized at once as Elena's. Along one wall, metal shelves held rows of glass vials, each stoppered and labeled. Some of the water inside was perfectly clear. Other samples were stained faint pink, darker red, or a dull brown that looked wrong even under the colored bulb. A few vials caught the red light and seemed to glow from within. Beside them lay field notebooks swollen with use, pages stuffed with dates, measurements, and hurried observations. In the center of the chamber stood a metal table. An old reel-to-reel recorder sat upon it, cables running to a microphone wrapped in cloth. Dust ringed its base, but the tape, already threaded between the reels, looked newer, its label marked with Elena's initials and a date from the year she vanished. Shadow padded up to the table and sat directly in front of the machine, body straight, eyes fixed on it as if he had been waiting for this precise moment. The tip of his tail touched Daniel's boot. Daniel stepped closer, breath clouding in the cold air. For a second his fingers hovered above the controls, the old reflex to walk away flaring hard. Then he pressed the large silver button marked play. The recorder clicked alive. Reels began to spin, tape sliding with a soft hiss. Static crackled through the speaker, followed by the faint, constant rush of something that might have been water moving under stone. "Danny," a woman's voice said at last, thin with age but clear. "If you are hearing this, the red vein is bleeding where no one can pretend not to notice anymore. They have drilled into what should never have been touched. They are feeding poison into the underground water and selling the surface with pretty labels. They will come for whoever holds this house. I am sorry. I needed someone who would keep listening even when people told him to forget." Shadow did not move. His ears stayed locked on the recorder, head tilted slightly, as if he were catching a second message under the words. "Trust the dog," Elena went on. "He will sense shifts our instruments only confirm later. Follow the red lines on the walls. Do not sign anything, no matter how kind their faces look, or how empty your pockets feel. Beneath this room, the water keeps better records than any courthouse. If I disappear, remember it was not the ocean that took me. Men did. The stone and the current will still be speaking even if my name is erased from files. Listen, Danny. Please. Just listen." The tape hissed, then clicked to a stop. The red bulb buzzed overhead. Shadow released a low sound that vibrated through the soles of Daniel's boots, something between a growl and a note struck on a hidden instrument. If this part of the story is already crawling under your skin, take one quick moment to hit that like button for Shadow, this dog who walks into the dark with no promise of reward, only loyalty and duty. Because what he leads Daniel to after this moment will not just change one broken man's life, it will force an entire town to face what has been buried beneath their feet for years. And once you see it with them, you will never look at water the same way again. Down in the cliff chamber, Daniel saw that his aunt had turned the basement of the house into something more than a hiding place. Against the far wall she had bolted a wide workbench directly into the stone, so solid it looked like it had grown there. A scratched amplifier, an old analog meter, coils of cable, and a faded spiral notebook were lined up in neat rows. 2 padded headphones hung from hooks like waiting ears. Just above the floor, a steel junction box was fixed into the rock. From it, a thick black cable ran down and vanished into a narrow fissure where the stone darkened and glistened. Around that crack, someone had painted a thin ring of red, the same color that traced the deepest lines on her maps. Shadow went to the fissure first. The German shepherd lowered his nose until it hovered just above the cable, breathing in the cold, damp air that leaked from below. His ears tipped forward, then back a fraction, adjusting as if something far beneath the house had shifted. He stayed that way for several quiet seconds, still and intent, before stepping away from the crack. Instead of pacing or sniffing the shelves, he turned and looked straight at the workbench, where the headphones waited. He did not growl or bark. The calm weight of his gaze felt like one clear word. "Listen." Daniel eased himself onto the stool in front of the bench. The metal legs creaked under his weight, complaining in a tired way that matched the old house. He flipped the amplifier's switch. A low hum seeped into the room, steady and faint. One set of headphones felt heavier than it looked when he lifted it from its hook. The padding was worn but soft as he settled the cups over his ears and shut out the steady drip of water and the faint clink of glass behind him. His fingers found the volume knob and turned it slowly. Static rushed in first, a harsh, shapeless hiss. He kept turning until the noise thinned and something else emerged beneath it. A single low tone rose and fell, then broke apart into a softer pattern. A muted thrum swelled, faded, and left a brief pocket of quiet before the next one came. Between each beat, a faint echo answered, late and distant, like the sound had bounced off canyon walls before it reached him. He had expected a dull roar, the kind of constant rushing he knew from pipes and pumps. This was not that. It moved in, slow, measured waves. A pulse, not the thin, frantic beep of hospital monitors, but something deeper, slow, rhythmic, alive. It felt like leaning close to a giant chest and hearing blood push through unseen veins. When the headphones sealed tighter against his ears, smaller sounds crept into focus. Tiny clicks, short scrapes, brief bursts of gritty hiss that did not match the smooth rise and fall of the main beat. Each time one of those coarse streaks passed, the rhythm faltered, then struggled back to steady. Daniel opened his eyes and looked at the analog meter on the bench. Behind its cracked glass, a thin needle traced what he heard. With every clean pulse it slid up and down in a gentle arc. When the rough noise cut through, the needle jumped into the red, held there for a breath, then snapped back to its usual swing. A strip of tape ran beneath the meter, its edges curling. In Elena's tight, black handwriting, 3 short notes labeled what he was hearing. Baseline equals vein. Spikes equals solvent. Count how often. Daniel lifted his gaze to the wall above the bench. One map there had been given more space than the rest. She had pinned a printed survey of the coastline to the rock and drawn over it in colored pens. A thick red line marked primary vein ran beneath the cliffs, right under the house, then curved inland like an artery. From it, smaller red branches spread into the hills. Thin blue lines showed rivers, springs, and municipal lines, where a red and blue line crossed. She had circled the meeting point hard enough to wrinkle the paper and written short notes in the margin. Town wells, irrigation, school. Down the side, a column of dates traced a slow change. 10 years back, pulse clean. 7 years back, first distortion. 4 years back, spikes more frequent. Last winter, interference almost constant. On the workbench, 3 glass vials had been set apart from the rest in a small metal tray. Their dates matched the column on the map. The oldest sample looked like plain water, clear and sharp under the red bulb. The second carried only the faintest haze, a suggestion of cloud if he held it to the light. The newest held a liquid with a barely visible reddish cast, so slight a careless eye might have missed it. When Daniel tilted that vial, the color clung to the glass for a heartbeat before it slid back down. A folded strip of paper lay under the tray, pinned in place with tape. Change now visible to the eye, his aunt had written. Source must lie above every junction. Problem is in the vein itself, not only in the wells. He set the vial back in its tray and opened the spiral notebook. Early, pages were clean columns of numbers and short notes. Date, hour, pulse, strength, tide, weather. Several years in, the margins began to fill with darker lines. New drilling noise on Eastern Ridge, past midnight. Unmarked tankers using service road. Filed anomaly report. Told deep layers are dead rock. Vane disagrees. On one page, she had taped a scrap from a brochure, a stylized sunrise over stylized waves, with the name Aurora Extraction printed underneath. Beside the logo, she had drawn a small skull and written, Marketing Purity, Burying Waste. Near the back, a full page had been boxed in red. The date at the top sat only days before she vanished. Aurora has found the red vein, the lines ran. Instead of shielding it, they pump solvent and byproduct into test bores that pierce its channels. Official maps erase these layers. The water does not. Every well tied to this artery will carry their greed. The last sentences slanted harder, letters almost cutting through the paper. If this record outlives me, assume the sea did not take me. Daniel, if you ever find this, I am sorry I left a burden instead of a warm story. You already know what it is to be ignored. Use that. The town will want paychecks, not truth. Trust the dog. The animals hear the change first. He closed the notebook, the pulse still beating in his chest, and felt shadow press against his leg. A pale glow slid down the stairwell from above. Daniel climbed until he could see, through a gap in the curtain. Far below on the switchback road, a truck idled at the overlook, headlights low, a figure by the open door, staring up at the house. Someone had found the house long before he had. Daniel walked back toward town with Elena's notebook flat against his back, and 3 vials of water knocking in his pack. Shadow stayed close to his knee on the damp road, breath fogging in the cold air. The cliff house vanished into the dark behind them. He passed the cafe and bar without stopping and turned toward the narrow building beside the library, the one with the peeling sign that still read Whitlock Geological. Elena had once said, "If the ground is hiding something, Nora knows." The bell over the door chimed when he stepped in. Closed. A voice called from the back. "Unless you brought a miracle, Grant." "It's Daniel Cruz," he said. "Elena Merrow's nephew." A chair scraped. Nora Whitlock appeared in the doorway, small and wiry in a heavy gray cardigan, silver braid down her back. She looked him over, then glanced at Shadow. "You brought a better escort than your aunt ever did," she said. Shadow sniffed the air and sat between them, calm and alert. "Come on," she said. "Show me what she left behind." At the table, Daniel spread Elena's maps, notebook, and the vials. Nora's hand hovered over the handwriting, then settled on the notebook, like she was afraid it might slide away. She put on thin glasses and read as he spoke. He told her about the hidden room, the cable disappearing into the fissure, the pulse in the headphones that felt like a buried heart, the harsh spikes that broke its rhythm. When he finished, she picked up the oldest vial and held it under the lamp. Clear water caught the light. The second sample carried a faint haze. The third left a pale reddish smear when she tipped it. 10 years ago, she murmured, tapping the first label. 5 years. Her finger moved to the second, then the third. Last winter. She was watching it creep in, while everyone else smiled for the cameras. She set the vials down and leaned on her hands. "Aurora Extraction has been drilling off permit for 8 years, Nora said. On paper, they poke shallow holes in dead rock and truck every drop of waste away. In reality, they've been punching through the layers that feed that red vein your aunt mapped." She tapped the thick red line Elena had drawn beneath the town. 6 months ago, they hit the main channel. That solvent trace in your last sample? Fracking runoff. They're choking the aquifer while bottling the cleanest pockets with mountains on the label and selling it as glacier pure to people who have no idea they're drinking the last clean veins of this coast. Daniel let the words sink in. "If you knew," he said, "why didn't anyone stop them?" Nora gave a short, dry laugh. "Because they arrived with contracts and smiles," she replied. Fish dropped. Tourists left. The council saw jobs and donations. When I stood up and said, "You don't stab the only heart your water has," they called me dramatic. When Elena filed objections, they called her unstable. People prefer a paycheck to a warning. Aurora counted on that. She paced once between the cabinets. They bought goodwill cheap. Jerseys, scholarships, repairs, their logo on every banner. Meanwhile, the trucks rolled at night to the old service roads with unmarked tanks. She stopped beside him, resting one hand on the map. "Your aunt kept listening when they pushed me out. I thought she couldn't let go. Now I think she heard something they couldn't allow on record." Daniel stared at the red line under Raven's crest. The memory of that pulse moved through him again, slow and heavy. He pictured sinks and taps and hoses, all drawing from a system being quietly poisoned. "So what do we do?" he asked. "I have this. You have your name on reports. They have lawyers and most of the town wearing their hats. Now we make pretending harder," Nora said. "Fresh samples from the dock, house, wells, school, duplicates to labs outside the county. photos, coordinates, dates. Then we walk into a room with microphones and leave them little room to lie. Before he could answer, the bell chimed again. Cold air slipped in around a man in a dark coat. His clothes were neat for a town. This tired. He shut the door, gently. "Miss Whitlock," he said smoothly. "Mr. Cruz. Good. Saves me knocking twice." Shadow rose and stepped between Daniel and the stranger. His body aligned with quiet purpose, tail low, ears forward, eyes fixed on the man's hands. The man offered a practiced smile. "Cole Harrow," he said. "I represent Aurora Extraction. First, congratulations, Mr. Cruz. That cliff property you inherited is a logistical mess for us and a ticket out for you. I'm here to help you trade trouble for comfort." He drew a slim folder from his coat, opened it, and set a check on the table beside Elena's maps. Even upside down, the number made Daniel's stomach clench. "You sign the land over," Cole said. "We wire this today. You and your dog can be on a bus by morning, headed someplace where the wind doesn't try to peel your face off. No more sagging, house on a cliff. No taxes, no landslide risk, no legal headaches. You walk away clean." For a moment, the room went completely still. A part of Daniel imagined a real bed, a door that locked, a vet who wouldn't need a donation jar. Then he felt Shadow's shoulder pressed against his leg. The dog's muscles had turned to stone. A low vibration began in Shadow's chest, not loud but steady, a warning that seemed to rise from the floor itself. It moved through Daniel's bones and across the table. Cole's fingers twitched on the folder. "You don't owe this town anything," he said softly. "Take the help. Let people who know the business handle the messy parts." Daniel laid his hand on the check, not to pull it closer but to push it back. "You're right," he said. "I don't owe the town, but I owe her, and I owe him." He nodded at Shadow. "The house stays with me." The growl rose once, then stopped as clean as a slammed door. For the first time, Cole's smooth expression cracked. Something flat and cold slipped into his eyes. "People who refuse lifelines often discover how deep the water is," he said. "I hope you swim better than you look." Shadow took one slow step forward. Just one. It was enough. Cole snatched up the check, slid it back into the folder, and back toward the door. The bell chimed too brightly as he left. Nora let out a long breath. Daniel kept his hand on Shadow's neck until the tension drained from the dog's body. The line between them and Aurora felt very clear now. If you're standing with this veteran and his dog, if a part of you wanted to shove that check back too, type Shadow in the comments. Because from here on, what this dog senses before anyone else will decide who walks out of this fight, and you are not going to believe what he catches next. The blizzard came in sideways, battering Stormwatch Cliff, until the house shuddered with every gust. Wind screamed along the rock, flinging snow in hard sheets that erased road, rail, and sea all at once. Down in the listening room, the red bulb swung on its wire, throwing nervous light across maps and shelves, while the hydrophone's low hum climbed toward a strained whine. Daniel sat at the bench, with the headphones clamped over his ears. Shadow pressed against his boot, and tried to pretend he was not hearing the sound of something breaking under the earth. On calm nights, the red vein, below the house, spoke in a slow, deep rhythm, a patient thump that rose and fell like a giant heartbeat. Tonight that beat had turned frantic. It hammered hard for a few seconds, then staggered, then lurched forward again. Between the pulses, a grinding undertone rattled through the line, harsh and uneven. Nothing like the smooth, watery murmur he had come to know. Each time the pressure surged, the meter needle slammed into the red and stayed there trembling. Elena's notebook lay open beside his hand. In tight ink she had written, "Sustained spikes mean nowhere left for the pressure to go. When that happens, the rock will pick a weak seam and fail." Shadow watched the fissure where the cable disappeared into stone. His ears stood high, nose twitching with every change in the signal. When a long, torn shriek ripped through the headphones, he flinched and let out a sharp bark. At the crack in the wall, low and warning, as if the earth itself had crossed a line. Dust sifted from the ceiling. A fine fracture opened in the plaster near the corner, tracing down the rock like a new, dark line. The red bulb flickered, dimmed, then steadied with a faint buzz. The bench shuddered under Daniel's hands. Then, the pulse disintegrated. The steady beat vanished, swallowed by a roaring snarl that sounded like stone twisting under too much weight. Daniel yanked the headphones off. For a second, the world consisted only of the storm above and the ringing in his ears. Then another sound slid through the noise, a distant, thin wail that did not belong to any machine. Shadow's head snapped toward the stairs. He listened for one heartbeat more, then bolted. Shadow. Daniel lunged for the leash, but caught only the end as the dog shot up the steps. By the time he reached the main room, the front door was hammering in its frame. He wrestled it open, and the storm punched him in the chest. Snow flew horizontally, scratching his eyes, filling his nose and mouth, turning the road outside into a white blur. Shadow was already a dark shape ahead, angled into the wind, moving with the sure purpose of a dog following a scent that had nothing to do with food or trees. He yanked his collar up, dragged his cap low, and followed the only thing in the whiteness that made sense. The service road had vanished under drifts and ice. He had to feel more than see, where it curved toward the switchback. The ocean's roar had sunk to a low, constant pressure under the higher shriek of air around the cliff. Shadow's outline appeared, vanished, then appeared again, always just far enough ahead to pull him forward. A sharp crack cut through the storm, like a gunshot. It was followed by the scream of metal tearing through metal. Headlights flared weakly in the whiteout, floating at an angle that made his stomach drop. Shadow's bark changed, turning rapid and urgent. Daniel skidded around the bend and saw the shape that did not belong there. An Aurora truck had slid on the glassy switchback and punched through the guardrail. Its front end hung out over the abyss, back wheels clinging to a crumbling ledge of asphalt. The entire vehicle tilted slowly forward with every gust, groaning as it decided whether to take the final step. Inside the cab, 3 men were trapped: driver at the wheel, passenger jammed against the dash, a third worker pinned in the back, leg caught under a heavy crate that had slammed forward on impact. Shadow stopped just short of the torn rail and planted himself between the wreck and the only solid anchor in reach, a stunted pine that had spent decades holding the cliff together. He barked in a steady pattern now, sharp, evenly spaced explosions of sound that cut panic into pieces you could count. Daniel wrapped the leash twice around the pine and clipped it tight, leaving enough line for movement but not enough for a desperate leap if everything went wrong. The dog leaned against the pull, eyes locked on the truck, rhythm unbroken. Then Daniel edged along the icy shoulder until he could press his shoulder under the rear frame. The metal was brutally cold, biting through his jacket, but solid against his bones. He planted his boots, searched for the tiniest ridges of grit beneath the ice, and pushed upward with everything he had. The truck rose a fraction of an inch, just enough for him to feel the weight shift off the front wheels. "Kill the engine," he shouted. The driver jerked, twisted the key, and the vibration under Daniel's back went still. The world narrowed to wind, Shadow's beating voice, and his own ragged breath. "Front first," he said, jaw tight. "Driver, then passenger. Move slow, time it with the bark." On each silent gap between Shadow's calls, the men in the cab edged their weight toward the uphill side. When the dog barked, they froze, letting Daniel reset his stance under the straining frame. Inch by inch, the driver wriggled free of the belt, crawled out the door, and crabbed along the ruined rail toward the pine, boots skidding on sleet. The passenger followed, teeth clenched, fingers white around any scrap of metal he could grab. With each man who left the cab, the balance changed, pulling harder on Daniel's shoulders until his muscles burned and his vision turned to streaks of white and gray. The last worker was young, drained, leg twisted under the crate. "I can't move it," he gasped. "You will?" Daniel said. "Rope." The driver grabbed a coil, looped it around the crate, then around the pine. On his count, Daniel rasped. When he barks, you pull. Shadow fixed on the truck and fired 3 barks, evenly spaced. On each sound the men hauled, while the trapped worker shoved, dragging his leg through scraps of slack. On the last pull, the crate lurched enough. He ripped his boot free and was hauled out through the side door. Daniel saw all 3 men clear and pushed away from the frame. The truck slid, hesitated, then tipped and vanished into white. A dull crash rose from the rocks below. The youngest stared at Daniel and Shadow. "You just saved the same company that tried to buy you out," he whispered. Daniel set his palm on Shadow's neck. "No," he said. "I saved 3 people. Das, in Ban. It is AA2 and Bannon here. If that hits you, remember this dog when you feel like you're hanging over the drop." 2 weeks after the truck went over the cliff, Raven's Crest filed into the old town hall like a tide. The banners with Aurora Extraction's logo still flapped along Main Street, but inside the brick building the mood had shifted. People packed the benches shoulder to shoulder, fishermen, teachers, cafe staff, exhausted parents, and the curious who had heard that tonight the town would finally hear what lay under its feet. At the front of the chamber, under the town crest, a table had been turned into an evidence stand. Elena Marrow's maps lay in sleeves, vials of water in rows from clear to faintly stained, and her notebooks beside a speaker and tablet ready to play the underground pulse and her last message. Daniel Cruz stood there with Nora Whitlock and the 3 workers from the crashed truck in the front row, jackets marked with Aurora's emblem. Shadow lay at Daniel's. Boots, big enough to block the aisle, quiet enough to be forgotten until he moved. His head rested on his paws, ear notched, eyes half-lidded but always tracking. He watched council members adjusting papers, the clerk shuffling files, the people squeezed against the back wall. His ears flicked toward each creak, each cough, each new scent that slipped through the doors. The judge, a narrow man with lined cheeks, called the room to order. He explained why they were there: to examine evidence that Aurora's drilling had harmed the aquifer and to decide whether the company could continue to operate. Aurora's lead lawyer, Cole Harrow, rose first. In a calm, practiced tone, he praised the company's jobs and community donations, then dismissed what was coming as unfortunate misunderstandings and the legacy of a troubled woman who spent too much time listening to rocks. Nora went next. She showed how water moved underground, how a single vein could feed wells for miles, and how solvents and pressure could turn that hidden river into a slow weapon. Then Daniel told the room about the listening chamber in the cliff, the cable dropping into the fissure, the pulse that sounded like a buried heart, and the way the rhythm shattered when foreign chemicals ripped through. He played Elena's message, her thin, stubborn voice, warning that men with money would hide whatever threatened their profit. The youngest worker from the wreck took the stand, hands shaking. He described late-night runs on old service roads, barrels of stabilizer pumped into deeper holes than permits allowed, and supervisors joking that if the water tasted odd one day, it would be another council's headache. He told them how the truck slid, the rail tore, the cab tipped over empty air, and a dog's steady bark cut through the storm and gave them something to move toward. When he finished, he wiped his eyes. Nobody smiled. Cole stood again, buttoning his jacket. "Emotional stories," he said softly, "but stories nonetheless. Old notebooks in a private basement are not peer-reviewed science. Trace elements in water are common. To leap from that to accusing a major employer of poisoning an entire town is irresponsible." Daniel felt heat rise in his chest, but before he could speak, Shadow moved. The shepherd stood, shook once, and walked away from Daniel, without a word from anyone. He padded straight to the front of the room, nails clicking on the worn floor, and sat beside the evidence table facing Cole. He did not bark. He simply stared, head level, eyes fixed on the man like he could see straight through the suit to whatever lay underneath. A few people chuckled nervously, thinking it was a trick. Then Shadow's nose twitched. Slowly, he turned his head toward the floor vent near Cole's chair. He leaned forward, drew in a long breath from the grill, and let out a single, sharp bark. The sound cracked across the chamber like a snapped wire. Daniel caught it a heartbeat later, a thin, chemical tang slipping under the smells of wet coats and varnish. Nora's eyes narrowed. "That is not furnace gas," she muttered. "That smells like solvent." Cole shifted his foot away from the vent. "This is ridiculous," he started, but the young worker sprang to his feet. "They used to hide leaks with fans," the kid blurted. "Run ventilation, so nothing pooled where monitors sat. If somebody opened a valve under here, fire code did what argument might not have." The judge ordered the area cleared. Maintenance staff popped the vent, then wrestled open a hatch to the crawlspace. Minutes later, they hauled out a dented drum wrapped in a blanket. A thin hiss escaping from a valve turned just enough to seep fumes into the room. The cameras swung as one. The drum sat almost under Cole's chair. For the first time that night, his calm slipped, eyes darting between the barrel and the lenses. The judge looked from the canister to the attorneys, and then to Shadow, who still sat by the table with ears forward, as if this outcome had never been in doubt. After the room aired out, an emergency cruise cleared everyone to return. The judge's tone was different. "We have heard testimony, seen physical evidence, and now watched an apparent attempt to interfere with these proceedings by releasing hazardous material into this chamber," he said. "Taken together, this is more than rumor." He looked out over the benches. "Effective immediately, Aurora Extraction's operations here are suspended. All unpermitted wells will be surveyed and sealed at the company's expense under independent supervision. The subsurface channel, documented in these exhibits, the red vein, is recognized as a protected, natural feature. From this day forward, the Elena Marrow Red Vein Sanctuary." His gavel struck the block. The crack echoed like the breaking of a long, invisible chain. For a long second, no one moved. Then the room erupted. People stood, shouted, cried, clapped with relief that sounded more like released breath than celebration. The workers from the truck sagged against the benches, eyes wet. Nora covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. Two council members stared at their notes, unable to meet anyone's gaze. At the very back, an old woman in a worn blue coat rose slowly to her feet. Her hands trembled as she gripped the bench in front of her, but her voice carried clear. "She always said the water was talking," she called. "Said if anyone ever truly listened, it would save this place. Thank you for listening." Dozens of heads turned toward Daniel and the dog at his side. Daniel did not trust his voice, so he did the only thing that made sense. He knelt, laid his palm on Shadow's neck, and felt the steady warmth there, the simple reality of bone and muscle and trust. Shadow looked up at him, then over the crowd, then back to the front where the vials and maps still waited. His tail lifted and tapped once against the floor. If you felt something when that gavel came down, if you have ever wished someone would say enough for the things that keep you alive, type the word "listen" in the comments and share this with one person who needs a reminder that truth can still win when somebody refuses to ever look away. Spring came late to Raven's Crest. For weeks, the ocean stayed the same dull gray it had worn all winter, and frost clung to the railings along the switchback road like it had forgotten how to melt. Then the storms began to break open. Strips of blue showed between clouds. Moss brightened the cracks in the stone steps up the cliff, and the tough little pines on the ridge pushed out new needles, soft and pale at their tips, as if the whole cliff were testing the idea of hope again. From the road, storm watch still looked impossible, a house nailed to rock halfway between sky and sea. But it no longer seemed abandoned. The leaning porch had been lifted and braced. Rotten boards were replaced, the rest sanded and sealed. Fresh shutters framed the windows in a calm, deep green. New anchors vanished into solid stone beneath the stilts. When the wind hit the siding now, the structure flexed and settled instead of shuddering. The shape was the same, the feeling was different. It looked less like a secret the mountain was trying to hide, and more like a place that knew why it was still there. Inside, the heart of the house stayed in the cliff chamber. Elena's maps hung in clear sleeves along the wall, red and blue veins threading under the coastline she had tried to warn people about. The hydrophone cable dropped into the same dark fissure, but the rig Nora helped design made it safer and easier to read. Next to the old reel-to-reel, a small digital recorder waited, with labeled tracks. Current pulse, archive pulse, Elena's last message. Above the bench, a modest plaque bore her name and the new title the town had carved into its records. Elena Marrow Red Vein Sanctuary, Listening Room. Daniel's life wrapped itself around that work. He slept upstairs in a narrow room with a window that looked straight out over the water, where dawn arrived as a thin band of silver before the sun finally pushed over the horizon. The main room held a scarred table, 2 mismatched chairs, a kettle, and a growing drift of notebooks. Someone had donated a sturdy bookshelf. Visitors slowly filled it with paperbacks, field guides, and histories of other coasts that felt like distant cousins. His possessions were still simple, but for the first time in years they belonged to a place, not a duffel he might have to carry away at a moment's notice. The last day, the carpenters were there. After the final brace went in under the porch, Daniel took his pocket knife and carved 3 words into the main beam. Listen first. The letters cut deep into the grain, rough but certain. The phrase had been Elena's habit. The thing she said about storms, strangers, numbers, and her own fear. Now, it greeted everyone who crossed the threshold. When reporters asked what it meant, he told them it was a rule he was still learning to keep. Hear what moves under the loudest noise before you decide what is true. Most afternoons, Daniel propped the door open and let whoever managed the drive up the ridge come inside. School groups arrived in bright knots of color, teachers trying to keep them from rushing the railings. Older residents moved slower, pausing in the doorway to take in the view they had lived beside their whole lives but never seen from quite this angle. There was no ticket booth. When someone tried to hand him cash, he nodded toward the metal box Nora had painted with branching red and blue lines. Its small sign simply said, "For the water and the work." Shadow took his work as seriously as any shift Daniel had ever pulled. He stationed himself at the top of the stairs, greeting each person with a quick sniff and a measured thump of his tail. Nervous children automatically reached for his fur, and he let them, solid and warm, a moving handrail with a heartbeat. If anyone leaned too far over the porch rail or clogged the stairway, he slid his body into their path until they stepped back. In the chamber, he lay by the wall, ears tipping toward the fissure each time the pulse surged, as if checking that the vein was still speaking in its own language. Little by little, town habits shifted. Aurora's glossy banners came down. Paper notices about community meetings and water testing went up in their place. The worst wells were taken offline, tanker trucks arriving with clean supplies, while new lines were planned. The school started sending home flyers about groundwater projects and invited Nora to judge. Science fairs that now included models of the red vein, alongside volcanoes and planets. People still argued about jobs and money, but they did it with test results and maps spread out between them rather than rumors and slogans. When the last visitors drove away each evening, and the tail lights disappeared around the bend, the ridge settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the hollow emptiness of the parking lot behind the diner, where Daniel once tried to sleep sitting up, but a full stillness, threaded with sound. Waves boomed against the base of the cliff. Wind traveled through the pines in long breaths. The repaired porch creaked softly as it cooled. Daniel sat in a chair near the door, boots propped on the rail, while shadow stretched along the boards like an extra strip of shadow thrown by the house itself. Sometimes, carried on that mix of wave noise and distant thrum, he thought he heard another sound, thin and bright, tucked just under the rest, a quick bubble of laughter. Elena's, the way it had sounded when she told a child that the sea had moods and the land remembered every footstep. He never mentioned that to all the people who came with cameras and notebooks. It was enough that when the wind turned a certain way, the house no longer felt lonely. On the nights when old restlessness rose, and the urge to put everything he owned back into a pack whispered at the edges of his mind, Daniel stood by the porch beam and set his palm over the poniver. Cut letters. Listen first. The wood felt solid under his hand, promise carved into grain. Shadow padded over, pressed his weight into Daniel's leg, and breathed slow and steady, as if reminding him that staying put to guard something could be its own kind of march. Together they watched the last strip of light sink, and the first faint stars push through the dark. Behind them, the house kept its small watch over the cliff. Below, the red vein carried on beneath fields, streets, and kitchen taps, unseen but not unheard anymore. And on that narrow ledge between stone and sea, a man and his dog kept doing the plain, difficult thing Elena had asked for all along. They listened, so the quietest truths would not be buried again. Maybe that is all any place really needs to heal. One person who stays, one animal who trusts them, and enough patience to keep listening when everyone else walks away. And that's the true story of how one veteran, one dog, and one forgotten house on a battered cliff helped save an entire stretch of coast, and every quiet life depending on the water beneath it, the kind of story that begins with two souls sleeping behind an abandoned shack and ends with a whole town finally hearing what had been speaking under their feet the entire time. Maybe somewhere along the way, while you were listening, you noticed that the real miracle was never money or courts or headlines, but the stubborn decision of a tired man to keep walking toward the thing that scared him instead of away, and the steady choice of a loyal animal to follow without ever asking for any explanation except the sound of his name. Daniel did not start this journey as a hero. He began it as someone many people looked past, someone who carried too many memories, too many empty nights, and too much silence in his chest. Shadow did not arrive as a legend either. He was just a working dog with a notch in his ear, a heartbeat that refused to quit, and a gift for sensing danger hidden in the cracks no one else bothered to check. Elena never lived to see the line of cars crawling up that impossible road, or the children tracing red veins on laminated maps, while their teachers explained what she had tried to warn them about. But her work is there now. Each day the door opens, stitched into the bolts, the cables, the charts, and the habit of listening before acting. Maybe you have your own version of ravenous storms and switchback roads, your own long nights sitting in some parking lot, wondering if anyone would ever see past the rough edges and scars you carry. Perhaps you know what it feels like to be treated like background noise, a bit of scenery people expect to fade out quietly when their attention moves on to something shinier. If so, remember this cliff, this house, this dog, this quiet veteran who once believed his life had narrowed to cheap coffee and worn-out boots. Remember that the moment he decided to follow a key toward a place everyone else avoided, everything began to tilt toward light. Not because the risk vanished, but because he finally understood that some battles are not fought with bullets and orders. They are fought with patience, truth, and the refusal to sign away what should never be sold. If this story touched anything tender inside you, if some part of you recognized that mix of weariness and stubborn hope, I want to ask you to do 3 small things that mean more than you might think. First, take a second and tap that like button. It costs you nothing, yet it tells the mysterious little gears controlling what people see that this tale was worth hearing. That stories about ordinary courage and unseen rivers deserve a place beside the loud, empty noise that usually fills our screens. Second, write 1 word in the comments that proves you were here with Daniel and Shadow until the end. You can type listen, or shadow, or water, or even just the name of your town, your village, your city, by the sea, or miles from any shore. That comment is not only for the algorithm, it is for the other tired hearts scrolling past, the ones who will notice your mark and realize they are not the only ones still, believing that loyalty, truth, and second chances matter. Third, if you know a friend, a relative, a coworker, or even a stranger online who feels like that forgotten house perched on the edge, weather-beaten, and one strong gust away from giving up, share this video with them. Send it with a message that says, "I saw this and thought of you," or "You are not invisible," or even, "You are the listener in my life." You might never find out what that simple gesture does, but sometimes the quietest rescue begins with a story arriving at exactly the right hour. And if you have not already joined this little community of listeners, consider hitting subscribe and turning on the bell, because around here we sit with the broken, we honor the loyal, we shine a light on the hidden rooms under ordinary days, and we keep coming back for more tales that leave you feeling like your own scars might yet serve a purpose. Every new story is another chance to stand beside someone on their wind-beaten cliff and remind them that the ground under them still holds veins of goodness the greedy did not manage to drain. Wherever you are, watching crowded apartment, quiet, farmhouse, hospital room, night shift break room, roadside truck stop, or a small bedroom with the lights off and the volume low, I want to speak a blessing over you before you go. May you find at least one person or one creature who stands beside you the way Shadow stood beside Daniel, without judgment, without conditions, simply present in the storm. May you discover that your voice carries more weight than your doubts ever suggested, that when you choose to listen first and speak from truth, entire situations can shift in ways you never imagined. May the hidden rivers beneath your ordinary life run clear again, washing away the lies that told you you were useless, replaceable, or too damaged to matter. May every place in you that feels like an abandoned house on some forgotten ridge be reinforced, restored, and filled with purpose you can feel in your bones. And when people finally come knocking, asking how you made it through, may you have the courage to point, not to trophies or titles, but to the quiet choices you made on nights when nobody was watching. If this story moved you, hold on to that feeling a little longer than you usually do. Let it change one small decision today, one apology given, one truth told, one kindness offered, one moment of listening instead of rushing to judgment. That is how cliffs are saved in the real world, how veins stay pure, how futures change. It is never all at once. It is always heartbeat after heartbeat, choice after choice, listener after listener. Thank you for spending this time on the cliff with us. Thank you for honoring Elena's maps, Daniel's long walk back toward himself, and Shadow's unwavering watch. Until the next story finds you, stay safe, stay kind, keep your ears open for the quiet miracles under your own feet. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply not walk away. And if nobody has told you this in a long time, hear it now before you click away. You are not background scenery. You are not the waste product of someone else's decisions, and you are not finished just because life pushed you to the edge for a while. The same way the red vein kept flowing in the dark, there is something in you moving, still singing, still waiting for you to put on the headphones and finally believe it.